Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode number 340 of The Zombie Train. I am your host, Ellis, otherwise known as the Admiral, and this week we actually are sort of doing two questions because the most recent one we got seemed, very similar to this one that finally came up in the rotation. The first question was Eastrail 11 asking on episode 276, what did you do when you retired steam engines of the zombie train? Did you scrap them or make a big museum of sorts? And Matthew Bacon, on episode 338, asked, after the war, when normalized civilization happened, did anyone start doing anything for fun? Leading off that question, did any of the ZT engines start getting used for sorts of excursion service? It says, if so, where and what? Another mini question, if any of the people that own the trains or locomotives that you used survived the war, did they ever ask for the trains back? I'll go back to front here and say that, sort of going off of what I mentioned in episode 338, there weren't really a lot of, first off, there weren't really a lot of people that survived in the first place. Much fewer people that would be well off enough to own a locomotive. There were a couple of cases of, people that either partly had owned a private car or members of a museum that were like, hey, you're using something out of our museum, can we have that back? And when we started retiring stuff, we kind of started returning things to where we got it. Some cases there were museums that were basically holes in the ground. In particular, the museum in Baltimore was in appalling shape, because despite the fact that fighting zombies had become very organized, by the time the U.S. Army got to Baltimore, they still managed to wreck the place. I don't know if it was because they decided to use it as a base. I'm not sure if they did. It was a half-decent location, I thought, to use as one, and we had reached an agreement to ferry supplies to it, and then that didn't happen, so I don't know what happened in Baltimore. I do know that when we went back to the museum, the building was a wreck, and we're like, well, what are we going to do with this now? We don't have... There was nobody that had claimed lineage or ownership of the museum or the stuff inside. There was nobody that was like, yeah, this was our museum. Can you fix it? So we were just like, alright, we'll just part these engines out. Which was a shame, because I thought that was a pretty neat place. But when we started retiring stuff, and I've talked about the order in which we retired things before, it was a lot of the one-off, the difficult to keep running engines, and then some of the smaller ones, and then some of the larger ones, and, the field narrowed to, northerns and Malays that were just too useful to put away. And then we started dropping those. And there were a couple of smaller engines that stuck around doing backwards service for a long time, but, there's effectively no steam on the Zombie Train Incorporated roster today. All these engines have either been sent to museums. Now, these are either the museum where they came from, if we had kept track of that, which sometimes we didn't, or just another museum that could house stuff. We started building up these servicing facilities, and then, like railroads of old, we had to change over to diesel servicing, and so they became less useful, and our roundhouses became more of storage than anything. So we started just sort of stuffing roundhouses full of locomotives and saying, yeah, it's a museum. It's a museum now, enjoy, guys. For the engines that we didn't have a place to return them to, like those out of Baltimore. And on occasion, not on occasion, but on occasion by class. There were a lot of engines or classes of engines that we mostly recovered from parks and stuff like that didn't fit anywhere else necessarily. We wanted to bring them back to the parks, but that was sometimes either pointless because the town effectively didn't exist anymore, or it was prohibitively difficult for one reason or another, and so these would end up in the roundhouses. But we also started parting out engines to the new towns, the surviving towns, the those that had sprung up as like, here, you can put this by your depot or in your park as like a a memorial, as you do, as you did before the war. There were plenty of park engines, and we wanted to continue that tradition, and we did, to the effect of, okay, let's take all these L1 clones that we made, our class of Mikado, and because they don't have a home, because we didn't take them out of a museum, and we didn't take them out of a park, we can just part these out to any towns that want to have an engine on display. Or that want to run an engine, because aside from things that were either very small, or things that were very specific, which, some places did want back, or people wanted engines to return to certain places, or we wanted them to do that, people doesn't necessarily mean people outside of the Zombie Train Incorporated. The Mikados made the most sense for people to take and turn into little excursion trains, because, yeah, some people did endeavor to do that. Not as many as you would, as you would hope for, because, well, the population of the Earth had been severely lowered, or has been, and there just weren't as many people to run or take tourist trains. And there were a couple smaller companies that snapped up old Zombie Train Incorporated steam locomotives to run them, but I'm not sure any commercial ones still exist at this point. At least nothing major. There are probably some branch lines that are running steam engines that were formerly ZT Inc., and among those are probably some of our Mikados, because we had a active production line for parts way later than maybe we should have, sort of because of reluctance to change over, because of familiarity and all sorts of other reasons. So it's still really easy to get replacement parts for those things. Not just because we had a stockpile, which still exists in some form or another, but because there are so many engines around, relatively speaking, compared to other surviving steam engines, there are so many copies around that even if you can't find a new part or find somebody to make you a part, you can just go steal one off of another one that's in a park somewhere. Yeah, that's less than ideal, but it is what it is. It works. And admittedly, you can... Some of what I'm saying you can take with a grain of salt, because I am so far divorced from any and all attempts to run a tourist railroad or anything in this day and age. I signed the order to, okay, we're going to retire steam now. We are going to try to bring these back to where we got them. And that's, and that's that. So have fun. As the company got larger, I've talked about this a number of times, I've tried to communicate it, but as the company got larger, I became farther and farther from the front. I mean, here I am today, at the head of our railroad, which is, again, a fraction of what it once was. I just hang out in my office in Quonset. And right now I'm listening to the rain pour down and the waves sort of threaten the facility, because of course today is just an awful weather day. But by and large, what I see is limited to what gets dropped at this desk. And for the latter half of the Zombie Train Incorporated, it's been pretty limited to that. We talk a lot about our building period and then our rebuilding period, and then it's like, okay, so the sort of years of steam and then steam into diesel, they came and went really quickly, relatively speaking. At least it seemed like it, we were in a state of constant change. And then things started to normalize, to balance out, and we just settled down. We figured out what to do with our newfound railroad and our newfound world. Yeah. I don't know. Hold on. Let's go back to the question and see if I can pull anything more out of them. Yeah. I mean, did anyone start doing anything for fun? Okay, so because of the need for not need for, but because of the desire for parts for those Mikados, for the railroads that picked them up, there were some of those engines that got scrapped, but they were considered to be lower priority than basically everything else. I mean, everything that we got, all of the steam engines, aside from those and the T1, were museum pieces, and yeah, we were trying to save the country, but at the same time, pay your respects to museum pieces. I did make sure, to the best of my ability from here at my desk, that we did not scrap any museum locomotive that we had taken. There were casualties, unfortunately, of course, because of severe damage from one thing or another. Some, it was just lack of maintenance drove them into the ground. I've talked about, were there major boiler explosions or accidents? And it's like, generally no, but we still compromised a lot of engines, and some of them, there is a deadline not far from here, because a lot of the engines, they came to Quonset for one last check. Not all of them, but some of them did. And some were like, alright, these are good, take them back, or take them here, or whatever. Again, not decisions that I necessarily personally made, but a lot of them were made here. And the other thing being, or the alternative being, no, they're in too rough of shape. They need to go now. Take this over to Cranston, and just park it. And we'll see if we decide to do anything about that later, because there were engines that were too far gone. I don't know. It's our standing commitment to try and restore and repair as many of them as we can, but I don't know. I don't... Oh, okay. Well, there goes the power. Alright, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I have to sign off now. I'll see you next week. This is the Admiral, signing off.